The earth covering William Hayes's grave was still loose and dark when his family came for the house. It was October 26, 1952, a Friday afternoon in Pinewood Junction, a brutal logging town wedged into the Colorado Rockies where the air already carried the metallic bite of frost. Elena Hayes stood on the porch of the timber cabin she and William had built with their own hands 4 years prior, her body wrapped in a faded wool dress that hung loose on her shrinking frame. She was 32 years old, but grief had carved a decade into her face in just 4 days. The funeral had been small. 17 people showed up at the Presbyterian Church on Bird Street, most of them loggers who had worked alongside William on the Northridge cruise. They had mumbled condolences with eyes that wouldn't quite meet hers, their hands calloused and awkward as they gripped her fingers. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Polk, had spoken for 12 minutes about dust and ashes, about the uncertainty of mortal flesh. Elena had heard none of it. She had sat in the front pew staring at the pine box, her mind locked on a single image: William crushed beneath 2,000 pounds of ponderosa pine, his spine snapped like kindling. The accident had happened on October 22nd, just after noon. William had been working a widowmaker, a massive dead branch caught high in the canopy. The crew foreman had warned him to leave it to let the winter winds take it down naturally, but William was stubborn about earning his pay. He had climbed 30 feet up with his handsaw and his rope, and when the branch finally broke free, it had taken him with it. The fall killed him before the branch landed. The doctors in town said he wouldn't have felt the impact. Elena didn't believe them. She had seen his face in the morgue, frozen in a grimace that spoke of understanding of that final terrible second when the body knows it's already dead. She had moved to Pinewood Junction in the spring of 1948, a registered nurse fleeing the gray monotony of Cleveland. Her parents had died in a house fire the year before, and the city had become a graveyard she couldn't escape. A cousin had written about work in Colorado, about clean air and mountains that made a person feel small in a way that mattered. Elena had taken a Greyhound West with 2 suitcases and $87. She met William Hayes 3 weeks after arriving at a Saturday dance held in the community hall. He was tall and quiet, with hands that smelled like pine resin and a smile that came slow but stayed. They were married 4 months later in the same church where they would bury him. The cabin had been William's dream. He had inherited a parcel of land from his father, 5 acres of rocky slope 2 miles outside town, and he wanted to build something permanent. Elena had helped him fell the logs, strip the bark, notch the corners. They had chinked the gaps with moss and clay, built a stone chimney that drew smoke clean and true. The roof was cedar shake, the windows salvaged from a demolished schoolhouse in Denver. It wasn't much, just 3 rooms and a cellar for storage, but it was theirs. Every nail, every board, every stone in the fireplace carried their sweat. When they finally moved in, William had carried her across the threshold, and they had made love on a blanket in front of the empty hearth, laughing at their own foolishness, at the absurd optimism of people who believed they could carve out happiness in a place this hard. Now she stood on that same threshold, watching a rusted Ford pickup rattle up the dirt driveway, and she knew with absolute certainty that her life was about to collapse. The truck door opened, and Garrett Hayes stepped out. He was William's older brother, 41 years old, with a nose that had been broken twice and never set properly. His face was harder than William's, had been carved by resentment and the kind of small cruelties that men inflict when they feel the world has cheated them. Behind him came Iris Hayes, their mother, a woman of 68 with eyes like flint and a mouth that seemed permanently twisted in disapproval. She had never liked Elena. At the wedding, Iris had told anyone who would listen that her son was marrying beneath himself, that a city nurse with no family and no money was little better than a whore looking for security. Garrett didn't bother removing his hat as he approached the porch. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, yellowed and creased, and held it out. His voice was flat, scrubbed clean of anything resembling sympathy. "You need to pack your things, Elena." She stared at him, her throat dry, her hands still stained with the clay soil from William's burial. "What are you talking about? William is barely in the ground. Which is why we're settling his debts now." Iris stepped up beside her son, her gaze sweeping over the cabin as if appraising livestock. William owed Garrett $4,200, gambling debts from Denver. He signed the deed of this property over as collateral 2 months ago. The words landed like stones in deep water, sinking slowly into Elena's comprehension. William didn't gamble. He never even went to Denver this year. That's a lie. Garrett unfolded the paper, revealing a notarized document with signatures and an official stamp. Sheriff Wade Brennan don't think so. He filed the transfer this morning. You're trespassing, Elena. You have exactly 1 hour to get your belongings off my property, or I'll have Brennan drag you off by your hair. Panic seized her chest, a suffocating weight that made breathing feel like drowning. She had no family. Her parents were ash in memory. William had been her entire world, the only anchor she had in this brutal place. She had no money. William's logging wages had been modest enough to buy their winter provisions, which were currently stored in the cellar below her feet. 50 pounds of flour, 30 pounds of beans, salted pork, and canned vegetables. Enough to survive until spring if she was careful. She looked at Iris, abandoning her pride in a desperate gamble for mercy. Please, winter is coming. I have nowhere to go. Let me stay just until the spring thaw. I'll work. I'll pay you rent. I'll do anything. Iris's face didn't change. 1 hour. Take only what you brought into this marriage. The cruelty was absolute and precise. They weren't just stealing her home. They were sentencing her to death. The nearest town with a hospital or a boarding house was 50 miles south through mountain passes that would be impassable in another 2 weeks. To walk, it meant freezing. To stay meant fighting people who had already demonstrated they would destroy her without hesitation. Elena turned and ran inside her mind, operating on pure survival instinct. The tears had evaporated, burned away by something colder and sharper. She grabbed William's heavy canvas rucksack from the bedroom and the old wooden cart he used for hauling firewood. She ignored the wedding quilts her grandmother had sewn, ignored the china plates they had received as gifts. Sentiment was a luxury for people who weren't about to die. She packed the Winchester Point .30-30 rifle William had used for elk hunting, along with 3 boxes of ammunition. She took the cast-iron Dutch oven, the hunting knife with the bone handle, William's double-bitted felling axe, and the cross-cut saw. She grabbed 2 heavy wool blankets, her thickest winter coat, and a pair of William's leather work boots that she could stuff with rags to make fit her smaller feet. From the pantry, she moved quickly, taking what she could carry before Garrett decided to intervene. A 50-pound sack of flour, a tin of salt, a jar of matches wrapped in oilcloth, 3 pounds of dried beans, a coil of rope, a small iron pot. When the hour was up, Garrett stood at the door with his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. Elena walked past him without looking back, pulling the creaking cart, the rucksack cutting into her shoulders. Garrett's voice followed her into the yard. Don't let me catch you on the lower valley trails. Wolves are hungry this year. She walked toward the tree line, the afternoon sun dipping behind the jagged peaks, casting long skeletal shadows across the meadow. She was utterly alone, cast into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a cart of meager supplies. But Garrett and Iris had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed Elena was a fragile city girl who would simply wander into the woods and perish. They didn't know that William had taught her the mountains. They didn't know about the secret he had shared with her on their first anniversary. 6 miles up the treacherous winding incline of Pinewood Ridge, far off any map trail, was a geological anomaly William had called the Devil's Chimney. It was a massive, naturally formed limestone cavern hidden behind a narrow cleft in the rock face. The entrance was tight, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways, but inside it opened into a sprawling, dry chamber. William had shown it to her during a summer hike, pointing out the narrow fissure at the top of the cavern's dome that led to the surface, a natural chimney that would vent smoke. If she could reach it, she wouldn't just have shelter. She could have fire. Elena dragged the cart up the mountain. her muscles screaming, her breath forming white clouds in the freezing evening air. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with scrub pine and mountain laurel, and the cart kept catching on roots and stones. She had to stop every 20 minutes to rest, her heart hammering against her ribs, her vision swimming with exhaustion. The temperature dropped as the sun vanished and frost began to crystallize on the cart's wooden wheels. By the time she reached the jagged rock outcropping that marked the Devil's Chimney, it was pitch black. She could hear the wind howling through the pines, a mournful sound that seemed to carry voices. She lit a single match, her hands trembling violently from the cold, and stepped into the narrow entrance. The stone walls pressed against her shoulders, claustrophobic and damp, and for a terrible moment she thought she might get stuck. Then the passage widened and she stumbled into the main chamber. The silence inside was deafening, broken only by the steady echoing drip of water somewhere deep in the cave. She struck another match and held it high. The cavern was larger than she remembered, roughly 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with a ceiling that arched up into darkness. The floor was relatively flat, covered in a thin layer of dust and scattered stones. At the back, she could see the glint of water, a small spring that fed into a shallow pool, and above her, barely visible in the flickering light, was the narrow vertical fissure that William had pointed out. The chimney. She had found her fortress. Now she had to prepare for the siege. The first night was the longest of her life. She built a small fire near the center of the cavern, using dry twigs and pine needles she found near the entrance. The smoke rose sluggishly, testing the chimney, and after a few anxious minutes, it began to draw, properly disappearing into the fissure above. The heat was minimal, barely enough to warm her hands, but it was light. It was proof that she could survive. She sat wrapped in both wool blankets, the Winchester across her lap, listening to the sounds of the mountain night. Around midnight, she heard wolves. The howling started distant and then grew closer, a chorus of voices that seemed to circle the ridge. She crawled to the entrance and peered out into the darkness. Yellow eyes reflected back at her, 3 sets, maybe 4, watching from the tree line. She fired a single shot into the air, the report echoing like thunder across the valley. The eyes vanished. The wolves didn't return that night, but she knew they would be back. She didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, feeding it carefully, rationing her small supply of wood, and thought about William. She remembered the way he laughed, a deep rumbling sound that came from his chest. She remembered the scar on his left hand from a saw accident, the way he would wake before dawn and kiss her forehead before heading out to the ridge. She remembered the last thing he had said to her, standing in the doorway with his felling axe over his shoulder. "I'll be home by supper. We'll have stew." There had been no stew. There had been a wagon and 2 men carrying a canvas-wrapped body. When the morning light finally filtered through the cave entrance, gray and weak, Elena forced herself to stand. Her body ached from the cold and the hike, her muscles stiff and protesting, but she couldn't afford to rest. Winter was coming, and she had maybe 3 weeks before the deep snows would make survival impossible without a massive stockpile of resources. She stepped outside and assessed her situation with the clinical detachment she had learned as a nurse. The cave was defensible and dry. The spring provided water. The chimney would allow for fire, but she had almost no food and no firewood. If she didn't build a supply that could last 5 months, she would simply go to sleep one night in January and never wake up. Her first priority was wood, not just a small pile for occasional warmth, but a relentless burning heart for her stone home. She took William's axe and ventured into the dense pine and birch forests that surrounded the ridge. The work was brutal. She had helped William fell trees before, but never alone, never for hours on end. She started with dead wood, the fallen branches and dry trunks that littered the forest floor. Each log had to be dragged back to the cave, sometimes 50 yards, sometimes 100. Her hands, unaccustomed to this kind of continuous labor, blistered within the first hour. By noon, the blisters had popped, leaking clear fluid that mixed with the pine sap and dirt. She wrapped her palms in strips torn from her petticoat and kept swinging. She worked 14 hours that first day, stopping only to drink water from the cave spring and eat a handful of dried beans. By sunset, she had dragged 23 logs back to the devil's chimney and stacked them near the entrance. Her entire body felt like it had been beaten with hammers. Her shoulders throbbed. Her back was a sheet of fire. She collapsed onto her blankets and slept without dreaming, too exhausted even for nightmares. The second day was worse. Her muscles had stiffened overnight, and every movement felt like tearing tissue. But she forced herself to eat another meager handful of beans, and forced herself back into the forest. She learned to pace herself, to take breaks every hour, to drink more water. She learned which trees had the driest wood, which branches would split cleanly, which trunks were too rotten to burn efficiently. By the end of the week, she had developed a rhythm, a mechanical process that allowed her mind to detach from the pain. Swing, split, drag, stack, repeat. By the end of the first week, her woodpile was 4 feet high and 6 feet long. She used the crosscut saw to break the longer logs into manageable pieces, a grueling process that left her gasping in the thin mountain air. She stacked the wood meticulously, creating a thick barrier near the cave entrance that served dual purposes. It was fuel, and it blocked the wind from howling directly into her living space. But wood couldn't fill her stomach. Her food supplies were disappearing with terrifying speed. She rationed herself to 2 small meals a day, but the beans and flour wouldn't last through November, let alone a 5-month winter. She had to hunt. Elena had never hunted before. William had brought home elk and deer, but she had never pulled a trigger at a living creature. The idea made her stomach turn, but starvation was a slower and more certain death than squeamishness. She remembered William showing her how to build deadfall traps, simple devices made from sticks and flat stones that would collapse on small game. She spent 2 days setting a perimeter of 20 traps across the game trails that crisscrossed the ridge, placing them near burrows and runs where she saw tracks. The waiting was agony. She checked the traps every morning, her heart sinking each time she found them empty. On the 4th day, she found a snowshoe hare crushed beneath one of the stones, its neck broken cleanly. She carried it back to the cave, her hands shaking, and forced herself to skin it with the hunting knife. The process was nauseating. The flesh was warm and slippery, the smell of blood thick in the confined space. She cut away the pelt and gutted the carcass, saving the organs in case she needed them later. She couldn't afford to waste an ounce of protein. She built a wooden smoking rack inside the cave, positioning it beneath the natural chimney. She used green hickory branches for the smoke, remembering something William had said about how hickory preserved meat better than pine. The cavern filled with a rich, acrid scent, and she hung the rabbit meat in thin strips to cure. Over the next week, she caught 3 more hares, 2 mountain squirrels, and a marmot. Each kill became easier, the nausea fading into mechanical efficiency. She was becoming something else, something harder. She also foraged with desperate intensity. The first snows would bury everything, and she needed to gather what she could while it was still accessible. She found late-season rose hips, small red fruits that were tart but packed with vitamin C to ward off scurvy. She dug through squirrel caches and stole pine nuts, feeling a pang of guilt that evaporated the moment she tasted them. She harvested wild onions and dried tubers, packing them into clay pots she found abandoned in a corner of the cave, perhaps left by Native Americans centuries ago. The discovery of the pottery was oddly comforting, proof that others had survived here before her. By early November, Elena had transformed the Devil's Chimney into something resembling a functional shelter. Her woodpile was now 6 feet high and 10 feet thick, a massive wall of fuel that represented 200 hours of back-breaking labor. She had 40 pounds of smoked meat hanging from the cave walls, strung high to keep it away from rodents. She had dried rose hips, pine nuts, cattail roots, and wild onions stored in the clay pots. She had water from the spring. She had fire from the chimney. She had 180 pieces of split wood, each one representing a night she might survive. She looked at her hands one evening by firelight. They were unrecognizable. The blisters had hardened into thick calluses. Her nails were cracked and black with grime. Her fingers were scarred from a dozen small cuts that had healed without infection. These were not the hands of a nurse anymore. These were the hands of someone who had been forged in desperation. She thought about Garrett and Iris sitting comfortably in her cabin, burning her firewood, eating her provisions. She imagined them laughing at the naive city girl who had walked into the wilderness to die. The anger that rose in her chest was clean and cold, a fuel more efficient than hickory. She would not give them the satisfaction. She would not die in the dark. On November 17th, Elena sat by her fire and took inventory. She had enough wood to burn a small fire every night for approximately 90 days, assuming she rationed carefully. She had enough food to eat one small meal per day for perhaps 60 days. The math was brutal and unforgiving. She needed more. The deep winter was coming, and she was nowhere near ready. But she was still alive, and that was enough for now. She wrapped herself in William's coat, breathing in the faint scent of pine resin that still clung to the fabric, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would wake and gather more wood. Tomorrow she would check her traps and hope for meat. Tomorrow she would survive another day. The mountain wind howled outside the cave, a sound like women screaming, but inside the devil's chimney, Elena Hayes tended her fire and refused to surrender. November crept forward with the inevitability of a glacier. Each morning brought frost that lingered, longer ice that climbed higher up the trees. Elena fell into a rhythm dictated entirely by survival. Wake before dawn, stoke the fire, melt snow for drinking water now that the spring had begun to freeze at its edges. Eat a quarter cup of beans boiled with shreds of smoked hare. Check the traps. Gather wood, forage, return before dark, sleep, repeat. The isolation was its own kind of violence. Elena had been alone before in the months after her parents died, but this was different. In Cleveland, she could walk to a grocery store, see other humans, hear voices that weren't her own echoing in her skull. Here there was only the wind and the silence and the relentless ticking of her own heartbeat. She began talking to herself just to hear language narrating her actions in a low monotone. Need to sharpen the axe. Blades getting dull. Can't afford a broken handle. The sound of her voice was both comforting and pathetic, a reminder that she was still human, still sane, at least for now. On November 12th, she made a discovery that shifted her understanding of the cave. She had been exploring the back chamber, following the spring to its source, when she noticed a narrow passage she had missed before. It was barely 3 feet high, hidden behind a jutting rock formation. She crawled through on her stomach, the stone cold and damp against her cheek, and emerged into a second chamber. This one was smaller, perhaps 15 feet across, but it was entirely hidden from the main cavern. The ceiling was lower and the air was stale, but it was dreary. Elena sat in the darkness of that hidden room and felt something close to hope. If someone came looking for her, if Garrett or Sheriff Brennan decided to check the caves on the ridge, they would find the main chamber and assume it was empty or abandoned. They would never think to crawl through that narrow passage. This could be her final fallback, a sanctuary within a sanctuary. She didn't know why she felt the need for such precautions. Garrett had taken the house. He had won. There was no reason for him to come after her. But instinct, that animal part of her brain that had kept her ancestors alive on savannas and in forests, whispered that men like Garrett didn't stop at winning. They needed to grind their enemies into dust. She spent 2 days hauling stones and dead brush to create a false wall in the main chamber, making the entrance to the back passage look like a natural collapse. It was exhausting, pointless work, or so she told herself. But at night, lying by her fire, she felt fractionally safer knowing that hiding place existed. On November 14th, she caught her largest prize, yet a young pine marten, sleek and fat from a summer of good hunting. The meat was rich, almost too rich, and she forced herself to eat it slowly to avoid making herself sick. She smoked the rest, adding it to her growing larder. 43 pounds now. She was gaining ground, but the calendar was her enemy. 2 weeks until December. 4 weeks until the deep snows. 6 weeks until the heart of winter, when temperatures would plunge to 20 below zero and the world would become a white hell. She worked herself to exhaustion every day, driven by a terror that lived just beneath her conscious thought. The fear wasn't of dying, it was of dying slowly, of running out of food in February and starving over weeks, her body consuming itself, her mind fracturing as the hunger drove her mad. She had seen starvation during her nursing training, patients wasting away from cancer or tuberculosis, their eyes enormous and shrunken faces. She would not become that. She would rather walk into a blizzard and freeze. But she didn't walk into a blizzard. She split wood instead. She checked traps. She gathered the last of the edible plants before the ground froze solid. She reinforced her woodpile, stacking it 7 feet high, now a monument to her refusal to quit. On November 16th, she shot her first deer. It was a young doe, barely a year old, drinking from a half-frozen stream 200 yards from the cave. Elena had been checking a trap line when she spotted it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the Winchester steady. She took 3 deep breaths, remembering what William had taught her about shooting: exhale, halfway hold, squeeze the trigger like you're surprising yourself. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, the report echoing across the valley, and the doe dropped instantly. She field-dressed it where it fell, her hands slick with blood, steam rising from the body cavity in the freezing air. She worked quickly, efficiently, cutting away the meat in sections she could carry. The hide she rolled carefully, knowing she could use it for clothing or blankets. The organs she wrapped in oilcloth, even the ones she wasn't sure she could eat because waste was a sin she couldn't afford. It took 4 trips to haul everything back to the cave, and by the time she finished, it was full dark and her body was trembling with exhaustion. But she had meat, 60 pounds of it, maybe more, enough to add weeks to her survival timeline. She hung it high in the cave, cutting it into strips for smoking, rendering the fat for cooking, scraping the hide clean. The work took 2 full days, and when she was done, the cave smelled like a butcher shop, rich and copper sweet. On November 17th, Elena allowed herself a moment of rest. She sat by her fire eating a full meal for the first time in weeks. Venison roasted over the coals, a handful of pine nuts roasted, hip tea sweetened with a tiny scraping of sugar she had been hoarding. Her stomach cramped from the sudden abundance, unused to being full, but the pain was almost pleasant. She was surviving. Against all odds, against Garrett's cruelty, and the mountain's indifference, she was still alive. She thought about William that night, about the life they had planned. They were going to save money and buy more land, maybe start a small herd of goats. Elena had wanted children, 2 or 3 enough to make the cabin feel alive with noise and chaos. William had wanted to build a workshop to spend his winters crafting furniture they could sell in Denver. None of it would happen now. Those dreams had died with him, buried under 2,000 pounds of pine and 6 feet of Colorado soil. But she was still here, and that had to mean something. The wind picked up that night, rattling the trees, and Elena pulled William's coat tighter around her shoulders. She fed another log to the fire and watched the flames dance, casting wild shadows on the cave walls. Somewhere out there, Garrett and Iris were sleeping in her bed, eating her food, living her life. The injustice of it was a physical weight, a stone lodged in her chest. But rage, she was learning, could be a tool. It could drive you to split one more log, check one more trap, survive one more day. She had enough wood for 90 days. She had enough food for 70, maybe 80, if she was careful. The numbers weren't good, but they weren't impossible. She would make it to spring. She would walk back down that mountain. And then Garrett Hayes would learn that some women don't die quietly. Elena closed her eyes and let the fire's warmth seep into her bones. Tomorrow would bring more work, more pain, more fear. But tonight, for just a few hours, she allowed herself to rest. The Devil's Chimney had become her home, and she would defend it with everything she had. The 18th of November arrived with an ominous shift in the atmosphere. Elena woke to absolute silence, the kind of quiet that felt wrong, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. The birds had stopped singing. The wind had died completely. When she stepped outside the cave to relieve herself, the sky was a pale, sickly gray, and the air tasted metallic. Something was coming. She spent the morning in a frenzy of preparation, hauling the last accessible deadwood she could find, knowing that once the deep snows hit, foraging would become impossible. Her shoulders screamed in protest, but she ignored them. Pain was just information. It couldn't stop her unless she let it. By midday, she had added another 15 logs to her pile. She was kneeling by the fire, roasting strips of venison for smoking when she heard the sound. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate crunching through the frost-brittle underbrush. Her heart stopped. She grabbed the Winchester and moved to the cave entrance, pressing herself against the stone wall, her breath shallow and controlled. The footsteps grew closer, and then she saw him. Garrett Hayes climbing the ridge with a canvas pack slung over his shoulder, a rifle in his hands. He walked past the cave entrance without seeing it, the narrow cleft in the rock too well hidden by the boulders and scrub pine William had pointed out years ago. Elena didn't breathe. She didn't move. She became stone, became shadow. Her entire existence reduced to the desperate hope that he would keep walking. He didn't. Garrett stopped 50 yards from the cave and knelt, examining the ground. He was tracking something, a deer maybe or an elk. His head turned slowly, scanning the ridge, and for one terrible moment his eyes seemed to focus directly on the cave entrance. Elena's finger tightened on the Winchester's trigger, her mind calculating distances, angles, consequences. If she shot him, she would have to hide the body. If Sheriff Brennan came looking, if Iris sent a search party, they would find his corpse and Elena would hang. But Garrett looked away. He stood, shouldered his rifle, and continued up the ridge, disappearing into the tree line. Elena waited a full hour before she moved her muscles, locked her bladder, screaming. When she finally allowed herself to breathe, the exhalation came out as a sob. He had been so close. 10 more steps and he would have seen the smoke from her chimney, would have investigated, would have found her. She couldn't stay here. Not in the main chamber. If Garrett was hunting this ridge, if he was ranging this far up the mountain, it was only a matter of time before he stumbled onto her. Elena spent the rest of that day and all of the next hauling everything she owned into the back chamber. The work was brutal. The narrow passage forced her to crawl, dragging the logs one at a time, pushing the clay pots ahead of her, the stone scraping her elbows raw. She moved the smoked meat, the blankets, the Dutch oven, the ammunition. She dismantled her smoking rack and reassembled it in the smaller chamber, positioning it beneath a tiny crack in the ceiling that she prayed would vent smoke as effectively as the main chimney. It took 48 hours of continuous labor, stopping only to sleep in exhausted 3-hour intervals. When she was finished, the main chamber of the Devil's Chimney looked abandoned. She scattered debris across the floor, kicked dirt over the fire pit, and spent half a day constructing a convincing false wall at the entrance to the back passage using stones and thorn bush. From the main chamber, it looked like a natural collapse, impassable and ancient. She retreated into her new sanctuary and sealed herself in. The darkness was absolute. No light penetrated this deep. She lit her fire and watched the smoke rise into the hairline crack above, praying it would dissipate before it reached the surface. The chamber was smaller, the ceiling lower, the air thicker. But it was invisible, and invisible meant safe. That night, Elena sat in her hidden room and felt the weight of what she had done. She had buried herself alive. If the passage collapsed, if the false wall shifted and blocked her exit, she would die here in the dark, entombed in stone. But the alternative was Garrett finding her, and that was a slower death, one that would involve humiliation and cruelty before the mercy of a bullet. She pulled William's coat around her shoulders and stared into the fire. The flames threw monstrous shadows on the low ceiling, shapes that writhed and twisted. She thought about the clay pots, about the people who had sheltered here centuries ago, before white men had carved this territory into parcels and deeds. Had they felt this same suffocating isolation? Had they huddled in this same darkness, listening to the mountain and wondering if they would survive to see spring? She hoped they had. She hoped their bones were scattered somewhere pleasant, somewhere with sunlight. On November 20th, Elena emerged from the back chamber for the first time in 2 days, crawling through the passage to check the main cavern. Everything looked undisturbed. No boot prints, no signs of intrusion. She allowed herself to relax fractionally, then crawled back into her hole and sealed the entrance again. She couldn't live like this. She couldn't spend 5 months in a 15-foot chamber with no light except her fire. But she didn't have a choice. Survival meant adapting. It meant becoming smaller, quieter, less human. She established a new routine. Every night between 2 and 4 in the morning, she would crawl out of the back chamber and venture into the forest to gather wood. She worked in absolute darkness, using only her hands to identify dead branches, dragging them back to the cave by feel alone. It was terrifying work. Every sound made her freeze, convinced that Garrett was watching from the shadows. Every snapped twig sent her heart hammering, but she forced herself to continue because the alternative was freezing. The wood she gathered now was green, still heavy with sap because the dry deadwood was gone. Green wood burned poorly, hissing and spitting, filling her chamber with thick, acrid smoke that made her eyes stream and her lungs ache. But it was fuel. It would keep her alive. On November 24th, she found tracks near the cave entrance. Boot prints, fresh pressed deep into the frost. Garrett had been here. He had walked within 20 feet of the Devil's Chimney and hadn't seen the entrance. Elena stared at those prints for a long time, her mind racing. Was he hunting or was he hunting her? Had he seen smoke from the chimney during one of her nighttime wood-gathering trips? Did he know she was here? She couldn't risk it. She retreated into the back chamber and decided she wouldn't emerge again until the weather forced her hand. She had enough wood for another week, maybe 2, if she rationed the fire to a few hours per night. After that, she would have to choose between freezing and exposing herself. The days blurred together in the darkness. Elena lost track of time, measuring her existence only by the dwindling pile of wood and the slow consumption of her food stores. She rationed herself to 1 meal every 2 days, just enough to keep her body functioning. The hunger was constant, a gnawing presence that made sleep difficult and thought sluggish. She became intimately familiar with the dimensions of her prison, could navigate it blind, knew every irregularity in the stone floor. On what she thought might be November 27th or 28th, she heard voices outside the main chamber, men talking in low tones. She froze her hand on the Winchester, her entire body rigid with terror. The voices grew louder, clearer. One of them was Garrett. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was casual, unhurried. They were inside the main chamber. Elena pressed her ear against the false wall, barely breathing. She heard footsteps, the scrape of boots on stone. A laugh. Then Garrett's voice, distinct now. "Nothing here, just a dead-end cave. Told you we were wasting time." Another voice, younger, unfamiliar. "Thought I saw smoke yesterday." "Probably just missed. These mountains play tricks. Come on, we've got 3 more miles to cover before dark." The footsteps retreated. The voices faded. Elena waited in the darkness for an hour, 2 hours before she allowed herself to move. Her hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the rifle. They had been 10 feet away. A thin wall of stone and thorn bush was all that separated her from discovery. She had been right to hide, and that knowledge filled her with a despair so profound it felt like drowning. On November 28th, the atmosphere changed again. The pressure dropped so rapidly, Elena's ears popped. The temperature plummeted, and a strange violet light filtered through the cracks in the stone. She crawled to the main chamber and peered out through the cave entrance at a sky that looked bruised and swollen, ready to burst. The great blizzard of 1952 was about to hit. Elena dragged the last armload of green wood into the back chamber, sealed the false wall as securely as she could, and retreated into her sanctuary. She built up the fire, wrapping herself in both blankets and William's coat, and waited. The storm arrived with a sound like the world ending. The wind didn't howl. It screamed, a sustained shriek that vibrated the stone beneath her. Snow began to fall in quantities Elena had never seen, thick curtains of white that obliterated visibility within seconds. The temperature inside the cave dropped so fast she could see her breath crystallizing, falling as tiny snowflakes onto her blanket. For the first 48 hours, the wind didn't stop. It roared without pause, a freight train locked on an eternal track. Elena huddled by her fire, feeding it carefully, knowing that once her wood ran out, she was dead. The green logs hissed and spat, releasing thick smoke that filled the chamber despite the ventilation crack. Her eyes burned constantly. Tears tracked through the soot on her face. By the third day, time had ceased to exist. There was no sun, no moon, no way to mark the passage of hours. There was only the fire, the darkness, and the unending scream of the wind. Elena's world had shrunk to a 15-foot circle of flickering light, surrounded by absolute blackness. She began to hallucinate, seeing William's face in the flames, hearing his voice in the wind. She talked back to the visions, argued with them, begged them to stop. On what might have been the fifth day, she realized she was running out of wood. She counted the remaining logs by the firelight. 32 pieces. If she burned one log every 12 hours, she had 16 days. But the storm showed no signs of stopping, and the cold was so intense that letting the fire die for even an hour might mean never getting it lit again. She made a decision that felt like slow-motion suicide. She would burn one log every 18 hours, banking the coals between feedings, keeping the fire as small as possible, while still maintaining heat. It was a gamble. If the embers went out, if she couldn't restart the fire, she would freeze within hours. The hunger was worse than the cold. Her body was consuming itself, burning muscle for fuel. Her ribs had become visible, sharp ridges beneath her skin. Her face had hollowed out, her eyes sinking deep into her skull. She was disappearing, becoming a ghost, even while she still breathed. On what she thought might be December 1st, Elena woke to a strange heaviness in her limbs, a pleasant warmth that seemed to radiate from her core. The fire was burning low, the flames a weak, sickly blue. She tried to sit up, but her arms wouldn't obey. A profound lethargy pinned her to the stone floor. And then she saw William. He was sitting on her woodpile wearing his red flannel shirt, sawdust clinging to his suspenders. He smiled at her, sit in knowing. His voice was soft, almost loving. Just go to sleep, Elena. It's warm now. It doesn't hurt anymore. A wave of euphoric comfort washed over her. It would be so easy to close her eyes, to let go, to drift into that warmth and never come back. Her eyelids felt like lead. Her breathing slowed. Then somewhere beneath the seductive fog, a tiny voice screamed, "Carbon monoxide." The snow had capped the ventilation crack. The smoke had nowhere to go. It was pooling in the chamber, silently displacing the oxygen, poisoning her blood with every breath. Panic cut through the lethargy like a knife. Elena rolled off her blankets, hitting the stone floor hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. She couldn't stand. Her legs were useless. She crawled every inch in agony of effort, her vision tunneling, her heart hammering erratically. She reached the axe, her fingers closed around the handle. She used it as a crutch, forcing herself up to her knees. Directly above the fire pit was the ventilation crack, now sealed with compacted snow and ice. She swung the axe upward. The blade clanged uselessly against the stone, the impact sending shockwaves of pain down her arms. William's phantom leaned closer. "Rest, Elena," she screamed. No, she shifted her aim, targeting the ice plug at the base of the crack. She swung again. Again. Her vision was narrowing to a pinprick darkness closing in from all sides. With a final, desperate lunge, she drove the axe head directly into the center of the blockage. The ice cracked. A rush of freezing air and snow poured through the opening, burying the fire, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. The temperature dropped instantly, so fast Elena felt her exposed skin burn with cold. But with the cold came oxygen, pure and clean and sharp. She collapsed onto the cavern floor, gasping her lungs, screaming as they expelled the carbon monoxide out and dragged in breath after breath of Arctic air. She lay there for hours, shivering so violently her teeth chattered, until the headache began to recede and William's ghost faded into the darkness. She had survived, but now she was in the dark in sub-zero temperatures with a dead fire. Elena forced herself to move. Working entirely by touch, her fingers numb and clumsy, she cleared the snow from the fire pit. She found her jar of matches wrapped in oilcloth and struck one. It took 7 attempts, her hands shaking so badly, she kept missing the striking surface. But finally the sulfur flared to life. She fed it dry pine needles from her dwindling supply, then twigs nursing the fragile flame until it caught. She added larger pieces, coaxing it back into a roaring blaze. When the fire was finally stable, she sat back and wept, great racking sobs that came from a place so deep she didn't know it existed. She had almost died. She had been seconds away from drifting off into that warm, false comfort, from becoming another forgotten corpse in the Colorado wilderness. But she hadn't. She was still here, still breathing, still alive. Elena wrapped herself in her blankets and stared into the fire. The storm raged on outside, but inside her chamber she burned. And as long as she had fire, she had hope. December arrived not with a calendar, but with a transformation so complete it felt like the world had been erased and redrawn in monochrome. The blizzard that had begun on November 28th didn't stop. It paused, occasionally brief windows of eerie silence when the snow fell straight down in thick flakes the size of silver dollars. But the wind always returned shrieking across the ridge with renewed fury. Elena stopped trying to track the days. Time became measured in wood consumed in the slow diminishment of her food stores and the progressive hollowing of her body. She had 21 logs left when she finally accepted that the greenwood wasn't drying fast enough in the cave's humidity. The pieces she had dragged in during her panicked nighttime foraging trips still wept sap when she split them, hissing and smoking when placed on the fire. They burned inefficiently, requiring twice as much fuel to produce half the heat. The mathematics were brutal. At her current consumption rate, she would run out of wood by mid-January. They burned inefficiently, requiring twice as much fuel to produce half the heat. The mathematics were brutal. At her current consumption rate, she would run out of wood by mid-January. The deep winter wouldn't release its grip until late March. She was facing 2.5 months with no fuel. Elena sat by her fire on what she estimated was December 8th and forced herself to confront the reality. She could ration the fire, further burning only enough to prevent hypothermia, letting the chamber temperature drop to just above freezing. Or she could venture out into the blizzard and gather more wood, risking exposure frostbite and getting lost in the whiteout conditions. Both options ended with her dead. It was just a question of timeline. She chose the slower death. She began burning 1 log per day, keeping the fire small enough to barely feel beyond arm's length. The chamber temperature dropped to the point where her breath formed clouds even inside. She slept in her clothes, wrapped in both blankets, in William's coat, and still woke shivering every few hours. Her hands developed chilblains, painful swellings on her fingers that made gripping the axe handle agony. Her feet went numb inside William's boots despite the rags she had stuffed around them. The isolation became a physical presence, a weight that pressed against her skull. She had been alone for over a month now, had spoken to no one except the phantoms her oxygen-deprived brain conjured. She began to forget what her own voice sounded like. When she tried to speak to narrate her actions as she had in the early days, the words came out strange and slurred as if her tongue had forgotten how to form consonants. On what might have been December 12th, she discovered something that made her stomach drop. The smoked meat hanging from the cave walls had developed a white fuzzy mold. Not all of it, but enough. 5 pounds, maybe 6 was contaminated. She cut away the affected portions with her knife, her hands shaking with frustration. She couldn't afford to lose even an ounce. She tried to eat around the mold on one piece, but it made her violently ill within an hour, her stomach cramping, bile rising in her throat. She learned her lesson. Moldy meat went into the fire, wasted, irretrievable. Her food inventory was now critically low. 32 pounds of meat, 2 pounds of beans, a handful of pine nuts, some dried rose hips that had shriveled to the size of raisins. No flour. She had used the last of it a week ago. She calculated and recalculated, trying to find a combination that would stretch to March. There wasn't one. Even eating only once every 2 days, she would run out by mid-February. Starvation, when it came, would be slow. Her body would consume its fat reserves first, then muscle tissue, then organs. Her immune system would collapse. Her mind would fragment. She would become too weak to maintain the fire, and the cold would finish what the hunger started. She had seen it before in the charity wards in Cleveland, the way the dying pulled into themselves, their eyes enormous and glassy, their skin translucent as paper. Elena refused to accept it. There had to be another option. She couldn't hunt in these conditions. The game had retreated to lower elevations or denned up for winter. She couldn't forage. Everything was buried under 6 feet of snow. But she could prepare. When the blizzard finally broke, if it broke, she would need to be ready to move immediately to trap and hunt with desperate efficiency during whatever brief window the weather provided. She spent 2 days maintaining her equipment despite the cold that made her fingers clumsy. She sharpened the axe blade on a whetstone she had found in the cave, the rasp of metal on stone, a small comfort in the silence. She cleaned the Winchester, working the action until it moved smoothly, and counted her ammunition. 43 rounds, enough to hunt, but not enough to waste on missed shots. She sewed repairs into her clothing using gut threads she had saved from the deer, her stitches crude but functional. The coat had torn in 3 places. Her dress was falling apart at the seams. She fashioned crude mittens from a section of rabbit pelt, the fur turned inward for warmth. The work kept her mind occupied, kept her from dwelling on the hunger that gnawed constantly at her belly. On December 15th, the blizzard entered a new phase. The wind shifted directions, coming now from the north, and with it came a cold so intense that the spring at the back of the cave froze solid. Elena had been relying on that water source melting snow only when necessary to conserve fuel. Now she had no choice. Every drop of water required fire, required precious wood, required decisions about whether drinking was worth dying sooner. She began rationing water as severely as food. 1 cup per day, barely enough to keep her kidneys functioning. Her lips cracked and bled. Her urine turned dark amber, then brown. Her headaches became constant, a dull pressure behind her eyes that never fully receded. Dehydration made the cold worse, made her thoughts sluggish and confused. One night she woke convinced that she was back in Cleveland, in her small apartment on Euclid Avenue. She could smell her mother's cooking, hear her father's voice reading the newspaper aloud. The illusion was so complete that when she opened her eyes to darkness and stone, the grief hit her like a physical blow. She curled into a ball and sobbed, the sound echoing off the cave walls, a broken animal noise that didn't sound human. When the tears finally stopped, she felt emptied out a husk. But the emptiness was almost a relief. There was no room left inside her for hope or despair, just the mechanical process of survival. Breathe, drink, eat, sleep, repeat. December 18th brought a change so subtle she almost missed it. The wind died completely. The silence was absolute, oppressive, like the mountain was holding its breath. Elena crawled to the main chamber and peered through the narrow cave entrance. The snow had stopped falling. The sky was visible for the first time in 3 weeks, a pale gray dome that promised nothing. She stood at the threshold and felt the stillness like a weight. This wasn't the end of the storm. It was the eye, a temporary reprieve before the second half hit. She had maybe hours, maybe a day before the winds returned. It wasn't enough time to hunt or forage, but it was enough to assess the damage. Elena forced herself outside, her first time beyond the cave in 3 weeks. The world was unrecognizable. The snow had piled in drifts, 20 feet high in some places, sculpted by the wind, into bizarre shapes that looked like frozen waves. The trees were buried to their lowest branches. The landscape had no features, no landmarks, just an endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark spears of pine tops. She walked 50 yards from the cave, her feet sinking to mid-thigh with every step, despite the crude snowshoes she had fashioned from bent willow branches. The cold was stunning, so intense it felt like knives in her lungs. She scanned the horizon for any sign of Garrett's hunting camp, any wisp of smoke that might indicate human presence. Nothing. The mountain was empty. She returned to the cave and retreated into her chamber. Her brief venture outside having cost her precious body heat she couldn't afford to lose. She stripped off her wet outer layer and hung it near the fire to dry, then wrapped herself in the blankets and tried to stop shivering. It took an hour before her core temperature stabilized. That night the wind returned with a vengeance. If the first phase of the blizzard had been violent, the second was apocalyptic. The sound was no longer a scream, but a sustained roar. A freight train that never passed just circled the ridge endlessly. Snow began to fall again, not in flakes, but in sheets, horizontal walls of white, driven by 100-mile-per-hour gusts. Elena huddled by her fire and felt the mountains shake. Somewhere outside, trees were coming down, snapping under the weight of ice and wind. She heard them fall distant cracks like rifle shots and imagined the devastation. This was the kind of storm that rewrote geography, that buried entire camps and killed livestock in their barns. People caught outside would freeze solid in minutes. On December 21st, winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Elena's fire went out. She had been sleeping, exhausted from another bout of stomach cramps brought on by hunger, when she woke to absolute darkness and bone-deep cold. She scrambled for the matches, her panic making her clumsy. The jar had tipped over during her sleep, spilling the precious matches across the stone floor. She groped blindly, her numb fingers finding them one by one. She counted by touch. 11 matches. That was all that remained. She positioned one of her last dry pieces of kindling, struck the first match. It flared, burned for 3 seconds, and died before catching the wood. She tried again. The second match broke in half when she struck it. The third caught, and she held it to the kindling with shaking hands, watching the tiny flame lick at the dry pine needles. The kindling smoked but didn't catch. The match burned down to her fingers, and she dropped it with a hiss of pain. She had 8 matches left. If she couldn't get the fire restarted, she would be dead by morning. Elena forced herself to slow down, to think like a nurse, to approach the problem methodically despite the terror clawing at her throat. The kindling was too large. She needed something finer, something that would catch from a single match flame. She tore a strip from her already shredded dress, fraying the fabric into individual threads. She built a tiny nest of cloth fibers and pine needles so delicate it trembled with her breathing. She struck the 4th match. It caught. She lowered it into the nest with infinite care, watching the cloth fibers blacken and curl, watching the pine needles begin to smoke. A tiny orange glow appeared. She bent down and blew gently, feeding it oxygen, coaxing it larger. The pine needles caught a small flame no bigger than her thumbnail. She added more needles one at a time, building the fire from nothing. 10 minutes later, she had a flame the size of her fist. She added twigs, then larger pieces, and finally the log. The fire roared back to life, and Elena collapsed beside it, her whole body shaking with relief. She had been seconds away from freezing in the dark. 4 matches remained in the jar. The close call forced a reckoning. She was out of margin for error. The next time the fire went out, she might not be able to restart it. The next time she ran out of wood, there would be no reprieve. She was living on borrowed time, and the debt was coming due. Elena made a decision that felt like surrender, but was actually the opposite. She would burn all her remaining wood over the next week, keeping the fire large and strong, because dying warm was better than dying slowly in the cold. If the blizzard didn't break by December 28th, she would take the Winchester walk out into the snow and end it on her own terms. She would not starve. She would not freeze by inches. She would choose her death. The decision brought a strange peace. She had spent weeks fighting, hoarding, calculating, trying to squeeze every extra day from her dwindling resources. Now she was free of that burden. She had a deadline. If the mountain didn't release her by then, she would release herself. She fed the fire generously that night, letting the chamber warm to something approaching comfortable for the first time in weeks. She cooked the last of her beans and ate them slowly, savoring every bite. She melted snow and drank until her thirst was satisfied. She wrapped herself in William's coat and closed her eyes, and for the first time since November, she slept deeply. When she woke, the quality of the silence had changed. The wind had dropped to a low moan, almost conversational, compared to the shrieking chaos of the previous days. She crawled to the main chamber and looked out. The snow was still falling, but gently now, fat flakes drifting down like ash. The storm was winding down, December 23rd, 5 days before her self-imposed deadline. Elena allowed herself to hope. Over the next 72 hours, the blizzard died in stages. The wind became intermittent gusting and then fading gusting and fading. The snow lightened to flurries, then stopped altogether. On December 26th, the sun appeared for the first time in a month, a pale disk behind thin clouds that cast no shadows but provided light. Blessed light that turned the snow-covered ridge into a blinding expanse of white. Elena stood at the cave entrance and felt something crack inside her chest. She had survived. Against all probability, against Garrett's sabotage and the carbon monoxide and the starvation and the cold, she was still alive. The mountain had tried to kill her and failed, but survival came with a cost. She had 3 logs left. No food except a handful of rose hips that were more seed than flesh. Her body had consumed itself to the point where her ribs stood out like barrel staves, where her hip bones jutted sharp enough to cut. She was too weak to hunt effectively, too malnourished to walk any significant distance. The blizzard was over, but the deep winter remained. She had bought herself time, but not enough. She would have to descend. The decision formed with the clarity of absolute necessity. Staying meant certain death. The cave had served its purpose, had sheltered her through the worst of the storm, but it had become a trap. The only game left on the ridge would be predators like her wolves, mountain lions, creatures desperate enough to hunt in conditions this brutal. She needed to get to lower elevations where the snow wasn't as deep, where small game might still be active. Elena spent December 27th preparing for the descent. She fashioned better snowshoes from willow branches and strips of hide cut from the deer pelt, weaving them in a lattice pattern she vaguely remembered seeing in a book. She packed the Winchester in her remaining ammunition. She took 1 blanket, the Dutch oven, the knife, and the 4 matches. Everything else she left behind. The cave had been her fortress. Now it was her tomb. On December 28th, the day she had chosen as her deadline, Elena Hayes walked out of the Devil's Chimney for what she thought would be the last time. The sun was bright, the sky a hard blue dome, the temperature well below zero. Her breath formed clouds that crystallized instantly, falling as tiny ice particles that caught the light like diamonds. She began the descent, moving carefully, testing each step before committing her weight. The snow was crusted on top, deceptively solid-looking, but beneath it was powder that would swallow her to the waist if the crust broke through. The snowshoes helped distributing her weight, but progress was agonizingly slow. She had to stop every 100 yards to rest, her heart hammering, her vision graying at the edges. Malnutrition had weakened her to the point where even simple movement was exhausting. She sucked on snow to quench her thirst, knowing it would lower her core temperature, but having no choice. Dehydration would kill her faster than cold. By mid-afternoon, she had covered perhaps 2 miles. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western peaks, and she knew she wouldn't make it to the valley before dark. She would need shelter. The thought of spending a night in the open without fire and sub-zero temperatures was terrifying, but she pushed the fear aside. One problem at a time. First find shelter, then worry about surviving until dawn. The terrain forced her eastward, away from the most direct route down. A cliff face blocked the southern approach, its base buried in a massive snow cornice that looked ready to avalanche at the slightest disturbance. She skirted it carefully, angling northeast, and found herself approaching the area where Garrett had established his hunting camp in previous years. The camp had been located in a clearing surrounded by old-growth spruce, chosen for its protection from wind and its proximity to a seasonal creek. Elena didn't want to go near it, didn't want to risk encountering Garrett or Sheriff Brennan or any of the men who had helped steal her life. But she was being funneled toward it by the geography. And as the sun touched the peaks and the temperature began its nightly plunge, she had no choice. She crested a small rise and looked down into the clearing. What she saw stopped her breath. The clearing had been obliterated. A massive avalanche had torn through the area, ripping centuries-old spruce from the ground and snapping them like kindling. The debris field was enormous, a chaos of broken trees, boulders, and compacted snow that stretched for hundreds of yards. At the edge of the destruction, barely visible beneath the debris, was the crushed remains of a Ford pickup truck. Garrett's truck. Elena stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. An avalanche. Here. The clearing had been chosen specifically because it was protected, because the slope above it was gradual and had never shown signs of instability. But the unprecedented weight of the blizzard snowfall had changed the equation. Something had triggered a release, and the mountainside had come down with the force of a god's hammer. She descended into the wreckage, moving carefully, aware that secondary avalanches were possible. The truck was buried to its roof, the cab crushed nearly flat by the weight of snow and debris. She could see boot prints leading away from the vehicle, already half filled with fresh snow. Someone had been here. Recently. No. She looked again. The prints led to the truck, not away, and they were her prints made as she approached. Elena began to dig. She didn't know why. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was the desperate hope that Garrett had supplies in the truck that she could salvage. She cleared the snow from the driver's side door, with her hands, her fingers going numb almost immediately, and peered through the ice-crusted window. The cab was empty, but through the rear window, she could see the corner of a canvas tent, the kind used for winter camping, crushed beneath a fallen spruce. The tree had punched through the truck bed and into whatever lay behind. She moved to the back of the vehicle and began clearing debris. It took an hour of exhausting labor, pulling away branches and shoveling snow with her bare hands. When she finally exposed the tent, she used her knife to cut through the frozen canvas. Garrett Hayes was inside. He was curled into a fetal position, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror. His eyes were open, clouded with ice. His hands were clutched around his throat, fingers locked in a death grip. He had been buried alive, trapped when the avalanche collapsed the tent around him. He hadn't died instantly. He had suffocated slowly in darkness and cold, knowing exactly what was happening. Elena stared at his corpse and felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, no grief, just a vast emptiness. The mountain had delivered its own justice, brutal and absolute. Garrett had come up here to hunt, to assert his dominance over the wilderness, and the wilderness had crushed him like an insect. She forced herself to keep searching. If Garrett had been camping here, he would have supplies. She found a canvas pack wedged beneath his body and pulled it free. Inside were 3 cans of beans, a half-pound of jerky, and a heavy iron lockbox. The food she stuffed into her own pack immediately. The lockbox she almost left, but something made her pry it open with the blade of her knife. The lock was frozen solid, and it took several minutes of work before the mechanism gave way. Inside was money, hundreds of dollars in cash, bundled and wrapped in wax paper. Beneath the money was a leather folder. Elena opened it with numb fingers and found the deed to her cabin. The real deed, with William's actual signature, dated 4 years prior, when they had first purchased the land. Clipped to it was a second document, the forged deed that Garrett had used to steal her home, the signatures obviously different when placed side by side. And beneath that was a ledger, a small notebook filled with entries in Garrett's cramped handwriting, detailing payments made to Sheriff Wade Brennan over the past 18 months. Dates, amounts, services rendered, bribes for looking the other way during illegal logging operations. bribes for filing false reports. And there on a page dated October 27th, 1952, an entry that made Elena's blood freeze. Paid Brennan $500 to file property transfer, deed forged by Morris at print shop. Told him it was for settling estate. Elena sat in the snow beside Garrett's frozen corpse and held the evidence of her stolen life in her shaking hands. He had documented his own crime. He had kept a record of every corrupt transaction, every bribe, every lie. And now that record was hers. She looked at Garrett's face and at the terror frozen there and felt a grim satisfaction finally begin to stir beneath the numbness. He had tried to kill her by abandoning her to the wilderness. But the wilderness had killed him instead, and it had given her the weapon she needed to destroy everyone who had helped him. Elena closed the lockbox and strapped it to her pack. She took one last look at Garrett Hayes, at the man who had stolen her home, and tried to erase her from the world, and then she turned her back on him and continued down the mountain. She walked until full dark, using the last light to find a small overhang where she could shelter from the wind. She had no materials for fire, so she wrapped herself in the single blanket in William's coat and tried to conserve heat. The temperature dropped to 20 below. She shivered so violently her teeth cracked together hard enough to chip enamel. But she was alive, and she had food, and she had evidence. The three things she needed to survive and to fight. She ate one can of beans cold, forcing herself to chew slowly despite her ravaging hunger. The protein hit her system like a drug, warmth spreading through her veins. She allowed herself 3 pieces of jerky and then forced herself to stop. She had to ration. She still had miles to go. That night, huddled under the overhang, Elena Hayes made a promise to herself and to William's memory. She would reach Pinewood Junction. She would present the evidence to someone who couldn't be bought. She would watch Wade Brennan and Iris Hayes dragged to cells, and she would reclaim every inch of what had been stolen. The mountain had forged her into something new, something harder than the woman who had walked up the ridge in October. She was no longer the grieving widow, no longer the displaced nurse. She was a survivor, and survivors didn't forgive. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind howl across the ridge, a sound she now understood as the mountain's voice. It was indifferent to human suffering, but it was not unfair. It tested everyone equally. Garrett had failed that test. Lena had passed. When dawn came pale and cold, she rose stiffly and continued her descent. Each step took her further from the cave that had sheltered her, further from the ridge that had nearly killed her. The valley opened below, still buried in snow, but touched with the first hints of thaw where the sun reached. She walked toward civilization, toward justice, toward a reckoning. Behind her, the Devil's Chimney stood silent and empty, a stone monument to the winter she had conquered. And buried in the avalanche debris, frozen solid in his canvas tomb, Garrett Hayes would remain until spring, when the thaw would reveal his body and the ravens would pick his bones clean. Elena didn't look back. She fixed her eyes on the valley and walked into her future one painful step at a time. The descent took 3 days that felt like 3 years. Elena's body pushed beyond the limits of endurance, moved through a fog of pain and exhaustion that made every decision feel remote, as if someone else was operating her limbs. The snowshoes kept her on top of the crust most of the time, but occasionally she would break through and sink to her hips, and extracting herself required energy she didn't have. Each time it happened, she wondered if this would be the hole she couldn't climb out of, if searchers would find her frozen corpse, half buried in powder, her hands still reaching for the surface. On the second day, she came across a frozen elk carcass, half eaten by wolves. The meat was freezer burned and tough, but it was protein. She hacked off what she could carry with her knife, not bothering to cook it, eating it raw because she had no means to start a fire. The taste was gamey and slightly rancid, but her starving body didn't care. She forced down nearly 2 pounds before her stomach rebelled and she vomited it back into the snow. She waited 20 minutes and tried again, eating slower this time, and managed to keep half a pound down. The food gave her strength, but also made her realize how close to complete collapse she had been. Her hands trembled constantly now, fine motor control gone. Her vision would occasionally gray out at the edges, her brain rationing oxygen to essential functions. She talked to William, constantly narrating her progress, asking him questions that she knew would never be answered. The boundary between hallucination and reality had become porous. Sometimes he walked beside her, pointing out safe paths through the snow. Sometimes she was alone. She stopped trying to distinguish which was true. On the evening of December 30th, she stumbled out of the tree line and onto the main road that led to Pinewood Junction. The road was buried under 4 feet of snow, impassable to vehicles, but it was a landmark she recognized. She was 8 miles from town. In good conditions, that was a 3-hour walk. In her current state, it might as well have been 50 miles. She found a small equipment shed beside the road used in summer by the highway maintenance crews. The door was unlocked. Inside were shovels, picks, bags of road salt, and most importantly, a space protected from the wind. She crawled inside and collapsed onto the dirt floor, not bothering to remove her pack or snowshoes. She slept for 14 hours straight, a sleep so deep it bordered on unconsciousness. When she woke, it was New Year's Eve, the last day of 1952. She lay on the floor of the shed and thought about the year that was ending. 12 months ago, she had been happy. She had been married to a man she loved, living in a home they had built together, planning a future that stretched bright and clear ahead of them. Now William was dead, her home was stolen, and she was a skeletal wraith who had spent a month living in a hole in the ground. If she survived to see 1953, it would be a miracle measured in spite and stubbornness. She forced herself upright and took inventory. 2 cans of beans left. The jerky was gone. The elk meat had frozen solid in her pack and smelled questionable. She had 4 matches, though she had nothing to burn. The lockbox was still secure, the evidence inside presumably intact. The Winchester had 3 rounds left. She had used most of her ammunition trying and failing to shoot a mountain hare on the first day of the descent. 8 miles. She could do 8 miles. She had to. Elena stepped out of the shed into a dawn so cold the air felt solid. The sky was the color of steel, pregnant with the promise of more snow. She started walking south, following the buried road, moving at a pace that would have embarrassed a child, but was the best she could manage. Her hip joints ground with every step, the cartilage worn thin from malnutrition. Her lungs burned in the frigid air. But she moved forward because stopping meant freezing. By noon, she had covered 3 miles. The landscape had begun to change, the deep wilderness giving way to logged areas and burned over sections where forest fires had cleared the canopy years ago. She saw tracks, now animal trails, that suggested she was getting closer to areas where game could still find food. And then, cresting a small rise, she saw smoke. Not wildfire smoke, chimney smoke, a thin gray column rising from somewhere beyond the next valley. Civilization. Help. Warmth. The sight of it nearly broke her. She had been alone for so long, had survived by her own will, and nothing else, that the idea of human contact felt almost threatening. What if they didn't believe her? What if Iris had spread lies, told everyone that Elena had abandoned the cabin voluntarily, that she was mentally unstable with grief? What if Wade Brennan had consolidated his power enough that her evidence meant nothing? She pushed the doubts aside and kept walking. One step, another. The smoke grew closer. The first building she reached was a trapper's cabin, barely more than a shack set back from the road in a stand of bare aspens. She approached cautiously and knocked on the door. No answer. She tried the handle. Locked. She peered through the grimy window and saw the interior was abandoned furniture covered in dust. The smoke she had seen was coming from somewhere further south. She continued, her frustration mounting. Every step was agony now. Her feet had gone numb hours ago, and she suspected frostbite but couldn't bring herself to check. Losing toes was a problem for tomorrow. Today was about reaching town. An hour later, she saw a small ranch house with a barn smoke pouring from the chimney, and in the yard a pickup truck, that had been recently driven the snow around it churned into muddy ruts. Signs of life. Elena approached the house and knocked. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s, heavy-set and ruddy-faced, wearing a flour-dusted apron. The woman's eyes went wide, her hand flying to her mouth. Her voice came out strangled. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph." Elena tried to speak, but her voice had rusted shut. She cleared her throat, the sound like tearing paper, and forced out words. "I need help, please." The woman whose name Elena would later learn was Dorothy Pritchard didn't ask questions. She simply grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her inside, shouting for her husband. Within minutes, Elena was sitting by a roaring fireplace, a heavy quilt wrapped around her shoulders, a cup of beef broth being pressed into her shaking hands. Dorothy's husband, Frank, was a taciturn man with the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors. He stood by the fireplace and studied Elena with the careful assessment of a rancher evaluating livestock. His words were measured. "You're from up the mountain." It wasn't a question. Elena nodded. "Alone, yes." "For how long?" "2 months. Maybe more. I lost count." Dorothy made a sound like a wounded animal. Frank's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a recognition of what survival like that required. "You need a doctor." Elena shook her head, the movement making her dizzy. "I need to get to Pinewood Junction. To the telegraph office. It's urgent." "Telegraph office won't be open until the 2nd, New Year's holiday." "Then I need to see Judge Marcus Caldwell, or anyone in law enforcement who isn't Wade Brennan." Frank and Dorothy exchanged a look, something unspoken passing between them. Dorothy's voice was quiet. "Wade Brennan is the law in Pinewood Junction, honey. Has been for 6 years. He's corrupt. I have proof." Elena pulled the lockbox from her pack and set it on the floor. Her hands were shaking too badly to open it. "Garrett Hayes forged documents to steal my property. Brennan helped him. They thought I would die on the mountain, but I didn't." Frank knelt and opened the lockbox. He examined the contents in silence, his jaw tightening as he read through the ledger. When he looked up, his expression was grim. "This is a federal crime. Multiple federal crimes. If what you're saying is true, Brennan won't go quietly. He'll have allies, people he's protected or paid off over the years." "I know. That's why I need to reach Judge Caldwell directly. He has jurisdiction over 3 counties. Brennan can't touch him." Frank stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered yard. When he turned back, his decision was made. "I'll drive you into town tomorrow, New Year's Day. We'll go straight to Caldwell's house, bypass Brennan entirely. But tonight you rest. Dorothy will fix you up, get some food in you, make sure you don't have frostbite that needs immediate attention." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to leave immediately, but her body had other ideas. The warmth of the fire, the first real heat she had felt in weeks, was making her limbs feel like lead. She nodded and let Dorothy lead her to a small bedroom, let the older woman help her out of her filthy, frozen clothes, and into a nightgown that smelled like lavender and safety. Dorothy examined her feet with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with winter injuries before. Her assessment was brutal, but honest. 2nd-degree frostbite on 3 toes. You'll keep them, but they'll hurt like hell for a few weeks. Could have been worse. You're lucky. Elena almost laughed. Lucky. She had lost her husband, her home, 2 months of her life, and nearly died a dozen different ways. But she still had her toes. Yes, lucky. She slept that night in a real bed for the first time since October, and she dreamed of fire and darkness and William's voice calling her name from somewhere she couldn't reach. New Year's Day, 1953, dawned clear and brutally cold. The kind of day where spit freezes before it hits the ground. Frank's pickup truck was an ancient Ford, the engine reluctant to turn over, but it eventually coughed to life with a cloud of blue exhaust. Elena sat in the cab, wrapped in borrowed clothes and Dorothy's heaviest coat, the lockbox on her lap, her hands clutching it like a talisman. The drive to Pinewood Junction took 40 minutes, the roads barely passable, snow piled high on either side. They passed other vehicles only twice, both of them snowplows working to clear the main thoroughfares. The town, when they reached it, looked half dead. Most businesses were closed for the holiday. The streets were empty except for a few hardy souls shoveling sidewalks. Frank drove directly to a large Victorian house on the north side of town, a well-maintained property with smoke rising from three separate chimneys. He parked and turned to Elena. "Judge Caldwell is expecting us. I called him this morning from the neighbor's phone. He knows you're coming and why. Let me do the talking first, establish the legal framework. Then you tell your story." Elena nodded, too nervous to speak. This was it, the moment where her survival either meant something or collapsed into futility. Judge Marcus Caldwell was a man in his mid-60s, tall and lean, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He greeted them at the door himself, no servants or clerks, and led them into a study lined with law books. He gestured for Elena to sit, but she found she couldn't. Her legs were shaking too badly, adrenaline and exhaustion warring in her system. Frank placed the lockbox on the judge's desk and opened it. Found deceased up on Pinewood Ridge in the avalanche debris. Garrett Hayes, this was in his possession. The woman here is Elena Hayes, his sister-in-law. She has testimony regarding property theft, forgery, and bribery involving your Sheriff Brennan. Caldwell put on reading glasses and began examining the documents. The room fell silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock and the crackle of the fireplace. Elena watched his face, trying to read his reaction, but the judge's expression remained neutral, professional. He read every page of the ledger, compared the two deeds side by side, examined the signatures with a magnifying glass. When he finally looked up, his voice was carefully controlled. "Mrs. Hayes, I need you to walk me through the events of October 26, 1952, and everything that followed. Take your time. Be specific." Elena told her story. She started with William's death, with the funeral, with Garrett and Iris showing up to claim the house. She described the forged deed, Brennan's complicity, her flight to the mountain. She detailed the cave, the stockpiling of resources, Garrett's sabotage. She told him about the blizzard, the carbon monoxide poisoning, the starvation, the descent. She showed him her frostbitten toes, her scarred hands, the evidence written on her body of what she had endured. When she finished, Caldwell removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He sat in silence for a long moment, and Elena felt her heart sinking. He didn't believe her. It was too fantastic, too convenient that she had found evidence in Garrett's possession. He was going to, "Frank, I need you to ride to the federal marshal's office in Boulder. This is beyond my jurisdiction to handle alone. We're looking at mail fraud, conspiracy, corruption of a sworn officer, and quite possibly accessory to attempted murder." Caldwell's gaze shifted to Elena. "Mrs. Hayes, you are going to need to repeat this testimony under oath, probably multiple times. Are you prepared for that?" Elena's voice was steady. "I'll testify as many times as necessary." "Good, because Wade Brennan has friends and they're going to fight this. You need to understand what you're starting here. This won't be clean or quick." "I don't need clean. I need justice." Caldwell nodded, something like approval flickering across his face. "Frank, get moving. Mrs. Hayes, you're staying here under my protection until the Federals arrive. If Brennan gets wind of this before they can arrest him, he'll run, or worse." The next 6 hours were a blur of activity. Frank left for Boulder. Caldwell's wife, a formidable woman named Margaret, installed Elena in a guest room and brought her food, real food, more than Elena had seen in months. Chicken soup, fresh bread, butter. Elena ate slowly, her shrunken stomach protesting the richness, but she forced it down. She needed strength for what was coming. At 4 p.m., Frank returned with 2 federal marshals, grim-faced men in dark suits, who looked at Elena with a mixture of skepticism and pity. They took her statement again, recording it this time in an official deposition. They examined the lockbox contents, photographed the documents, bagged everything as evidence. At 6 p.m., they went to arrest Wade Brennan. Elena insisted on being there. Caldwell tried to dissuade her, argued that it wasn't safe, that her presence would only complicate matters. But she was immovable. She needed to see Brennan's face when he realized his world was ending. They found him at the sheriff's office, sitting at his desk working through a bottle of whiskey despite the early hour. The federal marshals entered, first Elena and Caldwell behind them. Brennan looked up, his eyes bloodshot, and for a moment he didn't recognize her. Then comprehension dawned and the color drained from his face. One of the marshals spoke, his voice flat and official. "Wade Brennan, you are under arrest for bribery, conspiracy to commit fraud and corruption of office. You have the right to—" "She's a liar." Brennan was on his feet, his hand moving toward the gun on his hip. "Whatever she told you is a lie. That woman is mentally unstable, grief-crazed. She abandoned her property and—" The second marshal had his weapon drawn before Brennan's hand reached his holster. "Don't make me." Brennan froze. His gaze locked on Elena, and she saw it there, the recognition that he had underestimated her, that the woman he thought would die quietly on the mountain had instead become his executioner. She spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. "I didn't die. That's your mistake. You thought winter would erase me, but I'm still here, and I brought receipts." Brennan's face twisted with rage and desperation. "You can't prove anything. That ledger could be forged. Those signatures could be—" "We have handwriting experts." The first marshal stepped forward with handcuffs. "We have testimony from 3 people who saw you accept payments. We have bank records. The fraud unit has been building a case on you for 8 months. Mrs. Hayes just gave us the last pieces we needed." He gestured to Brennan's desk. "Now, are you going to cooperate, or do we do this the hard way?" Brennan looked at the gun still trained on his chest, at Caldwell's implacable expression, at Elena standing there like a ghost returned from the grave. His shoulders sagged. He held out his wrists for the cuffs. As they let him out, he looked back at Elena the one last time. "They said you left, said you just walked away. They lied, like you did, like Garris did. But lies don't survive winter. Only truth does." They took Brennan to the county jail in Boulder, processing him into federal custody. The arrest made the local paper the next morning, "Sheriff arrested in corruption scandal." By the afternoon edition, the story had grown, "Widow's testimony exposes bribery ring." By the end of the week, it would be regional news. But Elena wasn't there to see it. On January 2nd, Caldwell drove her to the Hayes cabin, the home she had been evicted from 70 days earlier. The property looked exactly as she remembered. The wood pile she and William had stacked still visible under its tarp, the chimney she had helped build rising against the sky. Iris Hayes answered the door, her face hardening when she saw Elena. "You have no right to be here. This property belongs to—" Caldwell cut her off, his voice judicial and final. "This property belongs to Elena Hayes, widow of William Hayes, is confirmed by a deed dated 1948 and verified by county records. You are currently trespassing. You have 1 hour to vacate." Iris's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. Elena pushed past her into the cabin, into her home. Everything was wrong. The furniture had been rearranged. Iris's belongings were scattered across surfaces that had once held Elena and William's things. The wedding quilt was gone from the bed, replaced with something cheap and garish. But it was still her home. The walls she had helped raise. The floor she had swept 1,000 times. The window where she used to watch for William to come home from the ridge. She turned to Iris, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of everything she had survived. "Get out." Iris tried to muster defiance, but it crumbled under Elena's gaze. Whatever softness Elena had possessed in October was gone, burned away by cold and hunger and 2 months of solitary war. She was something else now, something that had stared into the abyss and refused to blink. Iris gathered her things in fumbling haste and left without another word. Caldwell remained long enough to ensure she was gone, then handed Elena the original deed. "The federal prosecutor wants to speak with you next week. They're pursuing charges against Iris as an accessory." Your testimony will be crucial. He paused. What you did surviving up there alone through the blizzard of 52, that's going to become legend. People will talk about it for years. Elena looked at the document in her hands, at the proof of ownership that should have been inviolable, but had been stolen anyway by men who thought they could erase an inconvenient woman. I don't want to be a legend. I want my life back. Fair enough. Caldwell moved toward the door, then stopped. Can I ask you something? In all that time up there fighting to survive, did you ever think about giving up? Elena thought about the moment in the cave when she had been dying from carbon monoxide, when William's phantom had told her to rest, when surrender had felt like warm comfort. She thought about the morning she had decided to set a deadline to choose her own death, rather than wait for the mountain to take her, every day. But giving up would have meant they won, and I couldn't let that happen. Caldwell nodded, something profound passing between them, a recognition of what survival sometimes requires. I've been a judge for 32 years. I've seen a lot of testimony, a lot of survivors, but I've never seen anyone fight like you did. That mountain should have killed you. It tried. Elena walked to the fireplace and began building a fire, her hands moving through the familiar motions. But I didn't survive the mountain, Judge. I conquered it. After Caldwell left, Elena stood in the center of her reclaimed home and let herself feel it. The grief, the rage, the exhaustion, the triumph. She had won, but the victory tasted like ash and blood. William was still dead. 2 months of her life were still gone. Her body was still scarred, still weakened, still carrying the marks of what winter had cost. But she was alive, and the people who had tried to destroy her were facing justice. She walked to William's grave behind the cabin, the earth still loose despite the snow that covered it. She knelt beside the wooden marker and placed her hand on the frozen ground. I did it. I came back. I made them pay. Her voice cracked. I wish you were here to see it. I wish so many things. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of more snow. Elena stayed there until her knees ached and the cold had seeped through her borrowed clothes until the sun touched the western peaks and the light turned gold. Then she stood, brushed the snow from her knees, and walked back into her home. She had a fire to tend. She had testimony to prepare. She had a life to rebuild from the ruins. The mountain had tested her and found her unbreakable. Now it was civilization's turn. On January 15th, Iris Hayes was arrested at her sister's home in Denver, charged as an accessory to fraud and conspiracy. She pled guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, testifying against Brennan and providing evidence of other corrupt dealings. She served 18 months in a federal prison and died 3 years later, bitter and unrepentant to the end. Wade Brennan went to trial in March. The evidence was overwhelming: the ledger, the testimony, the forensic analysis of the forged deed. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He served 8 before dying of a heart attack in 1961. His name a byword for corruption in Colorado law enforcement. The lockbox money, deemed proceeds of illegal activity, was forfeited to the federal government, but then awarded to Elena as restitution for damages. $8,700 more money than she had ever seen. She used it to pay off what remained of William's debts, to repair the cabin, to buy livestock and supplies. And in the spring of 1953, she returned to the Devil's Chimney one final time. She made the climb in late April when the snows had melted enough to make the ridge passable. The cave was exactly as she had left it, the false wall still in place, the main chamber empty and echoing. She crawled through the narrow passage into the back chamber and found her sanctuary undisturbed. The smoked meat had rotted, the blankets were mildewed, the clay pots were cracked. But the axe was there, William's axe, the one that had kept her alive. She picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, remembering the blisters it had given her, the wood it had split, the ice it had broken. She carried it out into the daylight and stood at the cave entrance, looking out over the ridge that had tried to kill her. The world was green again, alive with snowmelt and bird song and the promise of summer. The mountain looked peaceful, benign, as if winter had never happened. But Elena knew better. She knew what the mountain was capable of. She knew the violence that could sleep beneath beauty, the death that waited in the cold places. And she knew that she had faced it and survived, that she had been forged in ice and hunger into something unbreakable. She left the cave unsealed, a monument to what she had endured. Someday perhaps someone else would find it. They would see the fire-blackened stones, the remnants of her smoking rack, the scratches on the walls where she had kept time. They would wonder who had lived there, what story those stones could tell. Let them wonder. Elena had no interest in being remembered. She had already paid the price for her survival. What mattered now was the life she would build from what remained. She walked down the mountain for the last time carrying William's axe over her shoulder, and when she reached the valley floor, she didn't look back. The Devil's Chimney receded behind her smaller with each step until it was just another shadow on the ridge. Elena Hayes went home. And for the first time in 6 months, home meant safety, meant peace, meant a future that belonged to her alone. The winter had taken everything she loved and tried to take her life, but it had failed. And in